everyone, my name is Brendan and I'm super excited to give you the Predent's Guide to the DAT presented by DAT Bootcamp. This presentation is designed for anybody who's planning on taking the DAT, whether you're going to take it in the next few weeks or especially if you're not taking it for the next couple years. This is designed to help you plan, prepare for, and ace the DAT. Before we get going too far, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. Like I said, my name is Brendan, and all throughout my college experience, I had a 3.6 GPA, which for dental school admissions is pretty average. It's nothing too special. It's pretty middle of the road. And I struggled in a lot of my undergrad courses. So general chemistry in particular was one that was really hard for me. A lot of the other science courses did not come easily to me. I always felt like I had to study really, really hard just to scrape by. And when I first started studying for the DAT, I was using DAT Bootcamp, and I took a practice test for the Quantitative Reasoning section. And in my practice test, I did so bad that DAT Bootcamp told me my score could not even be calculated. So that was pretty discouraging, as you can imagine. And a lot of times I wondered, because of my academic struggles, if I would be able to succeed on the DAT or not. Well, after studying with DAT Bootcamp, I was able to score a 26 academic average on the DAT. I scored in the 98th percentile in 3 categories, and I went from getting a score that was too low to be calculated to getting a 27 on the quantitative reasoning. So here's a picture of my wife and I the day I finished my exam with my score report. I was so happy to have gotten my score, and it opened up a lot of opportunities for me. I was able to get accepted to one of my dream dental schools, University of the Pacific, where I'm attending now, and several other dental schools as well. So the reason that I share this is I want all of you to know that no matter what your academic background is like, no matter what your situation is like, you absolutely can succeed on the DAT. Today we're going to talk about how to plan for that and how to get from where you are now to accomplishing your dental school dreams with an awesome score on the DAT. So in this video, we're going to cover a lot of different things regarding the DAT. I'm going to start with an overview of the content you can expect on the DAT and how it's scored. Then from there, we'll go into how to plan for the DAT as far as what your timeline should look like for how much time you need to study, when you should sign up versus when you should take the DAT to be ready for the application cycle. And then we'll end the video with some of my personal tips on how to succeed on each of the 6 subsections of the DAT. If you're taking the DAT a year from now or more than a year from now, I would definitely recommend watching the full video because lots of details are going to be very important for you. If you're really close to the DAT, a lot of the stuff in the beginning of this video might be review for you, so you might want to skip ahead to the tips at the end that will really help you as you're studying. So here's an outline of what the DAT looks like, some of the content that you can expect on it. It's about a 5-hour test, so it is very long, and it starts off with a section called the Survey of the Natural Sciences. So for this section, you have 90 minutes total, but it's broken up into 3 subsections. These 3 subsections consist of biology, general chemistry, and organic chemistry. It's important to note that these 90 minutes, they'll just give them to you all at once, and then it's up to you to decide how much time you want to spend on each of these 3 subcategories. The first one is biology. It's always going to be first. So when you start the DAT, you'll have 40 questions of biology right off the bat. All the questions on the DAT are multiple choice, and the biology ones are a little bit tricky because they are so broad. So they can test you on anything from animal behavior to physiology concepts to genetics, etc., etc. It'll be a little tough to know all these different things, but look towards the end of the video to see some of my tips for how to succeed in biology. And they can test you on anything from courses you might have taken in college. If there are some topics I mentioned or some things that you're seeing that you haven't taken classes for, don't worry. DAT Bootcamp has lots of resources to teach you everything that you need to know for the DAT. So after you finish the biology section, you'll move on to general chemistry. And this section is made up of 30 questions. I would recommend taking around 30 minutes to take care of all those questions. And these are going to be a good mix of both conceptual questions and also calculation-based questions. For the calculation-based questions, it's really important that you have a sound understanding of all the reactions from your General Chemistry 1 and General Chemistry 2 classes. The questions in this section can also test you on lab concepts from General Chemistry. After you finish that section, you'll then move on to Organic Chemistry, and if you've budgeted your time well, this 90 minutes, you'll have enough time to finish. Sometimes students get too caught up on bio or gen chem, and then they get to OChem and they're almost out of time. So make sure that doesn't happen to you. And the OChem section, it's going to cover anything from Organic Chemistry 1, Organic Chemistry 2, and OChem labs that you might have taken in college. So if you've taken OChem, you'll know that it's very, very reaction heavy. Knowing those reactions will be very important for the DAT. So you'll have to know, if you take this reagent and this one, what's going to happen when you combine them. It's important to have those memorized and have a really good understanding of them as well. So after you finish the organic chemistry section, you'll then move on to the next portion of the DAT, which is the perceptual ability test. And the perceptual ability test, or the PAT as we call it, it's designed to gauge your ability to look at something and be able to picture an object in 3D space place in your mind, or look at something and be able to measure it just by taking a glance at it. These are tricky concepts, or abilities I should say, but they are very important for dentistry. For example, when you are preparing a crown as a dentist, you need to be able to picture in your mind's eye, what does the other side of this crown look like that I can't really see that well? How will it fit on the prep, or in the crown that I'm making? How will that fit on the prep that I'm getting ready? So these are important skills, and they want to see here if you have an ability to do that. This part of the DAT is a little bit more fast paced. You have 90 questions to answer in 60 minutes, so you'll want to aim for less than a minute per question. And here are some of the different categories of questions that will show up on the perceptual ability test. These ones are keyholes. They give you a three-dimensional object, and then they ask you which of those options A through E would that object fit through perfectly, like a key going through a keyhole. Another one is top front end. Well, they'll show you a design of an object, and they'll show you two of the sides, and then they'll make you guess which object of the options is represented in the image on the left based on what you can see. Another one is angle ranking. This one gives a lot of students some trouble, and they give you these angles and then tell you to rank them in order from their size. Another one is hole punching. For this one, they have you fold paper up. Well, in your mind, you mentally fold paper up, and then they show you if they punched a hole in it, what would it look like when they unfolded it. And cube counting, this one has you count up all the different sides of the cubes and see what surfaces of the cubes would be covered if this was doused in paint all around. Another one is pattern folding. For this one, they show you an object. If it was like an origami that was unfolded, what would it look like when it was then folded up? So if you're a little bit more curious about these perceptual ability test questions and you want to learn more about them, you can go to DAT Bootcamp and make a free account and start studying some of these concepts now. There's some videos you can watch that can give you a better breakdown of how to master them. So that's the perceptual ability test. And once you finish that, you get a much needed break. You have 30 minutes, and during this time, you can get up from your chair, you can go to your locker and get your phone and snacks and anything else. You can even leave the testing center. I would recommend using this time to go outside, get some fresh air, maybe call a friend or a loved one for some encouragement, and just really hit refresh before starting the next half of the test. So after that, you have reading comprehension, and this is a little bit similar to what you might have seen on reading comprehension in the past on standardized tests. On the DAT, they're going to give you 3 passages and a total of 60 minutes to answer 50 questions. There'll be somewhere around 16 to 18 questions for each passage. Just like in the survey of the natural sciences, this 60 minutes, it's given to you in one big lump. So you'll want to make sure to budget out enough time, probably 20 minutes for each of the 3 passages. Now these passages, they're usually science related. You can see some of the topics of sample ones from DAT Bootcamp here. However, they'll never require you to know anything outside of the passage. So all the information needed to answer the questions will be contained in the passages. After you finish reading comprehension, there is the quantitative reasoning portion, and this is what is sometimes called the math portion of the DAT. It does involve some math, but beyond that, it's really meant to determine your ability to reason your way through things, to use logic to solve problems. So it does involve numbers. It can involve topics like algebra and geometry, but it's also testing your logic. Be prepared for that because it is a little different than math that you might have taken in the past. So after you finish the DAT, it's about 5 hours, like I said, and you'll take this post-test survey. And after which, if you are taking the DAT before March 1st of 2025, you will get your score right then and there after you finish the DAT. If you are taking your DAT on or after March 1st, 2025, then you'll need to wait a couple weeks while they process your score, and then they'll send it to you a couple weeks later. We'll get a little bit more into the scoring changes and what those will look like if that's something that you're going to need to worry about or not. So let's talk about scoring on the DAT. Now, you may have heard that the ADA is making some changes to scoring on the DAT. So first, I'm going to talk about how the DAT is scored now, but then afterwards, I'll give an explanation for what are the changes that the ADA is making and how will that affect you if you're taking the DAT later. These scoring changes I'm referring to are going to take place starting March 1st, 2025, according to what the ADA has told us now. So if you're taking your DAT before then, don't worry about the changes. If you're taking the DAT after March 1st, 2025, then listen when I explain those changes so you can know how this applies to you. So how it is now is that each of these sections will get their own score out of 30 points. But notice that it's not scored on a direct scale. So for example, organic chemistry, like I told you, has 30 multiple choice questions for that section. However, if you miss just 2 questions, it doesn't mean that you get a 28 out of 30. Instead, the ADA has this conversion chart that you can look at if you go to their website, and it explains a little bit more about how to convert from the raw score to the standard standard score. So for example, with organic chemistry, if you get all 30 questions right, you can score a 30 on the DAT. However, if you miss just one question of those 30 questions, you get somewhere around a 27 to a 29. If you miss just 2 questions of those 30, you don't get a 28, but instead you get somewhere in this 24 to 26 range. The ADA, they use a lot of different metrics to determine this conversion from your raw score to your standard score. So they're going to look at how difficult was your DAT exam compared to other people's DAT exams. Sometimes they'll include sample questions in your test that aren't actually going to count towards your score, but they're testing out and they want to see how they perform. And there's lots of other things that they take into account as well. So this is just an estimate, but hopefully it shows you that missing just a couple questions on each section can bring your score down pretty fast. Do note, however, that we'll talk about this more in a moment, but these upper 20 scores are really good scores. So it's not bad if you get somewhere in this range. That's actually a really excellent score. So take some time to look at this and get familiar a little bit with how the conversion works from the raw score to the standard score. So if you finish the DAT before March 1st, 2025, like I mentioned before, when you finish your test, you'll walk out of the testing center with this score report, and it's going to have all of these scores for each of the 6 subsections from perceptual ability to organic chemistry. And we talked a little bit about how these are calculated. You'll also see here this total science and academic average score. So what those are is the total science is your biology, general chemistry, and organic chemistry. They take all those 3 scores into account to give you a total science score. The other one that's a summary score is the academic average. This is usually the most commonly referred to score when we talk about what people got on the DAT or what schools are looking for. Usually people are referring to this academic average, and it takes into account every section except for perceptual ability. It is just the average of your score in each of these other 5 categories, and both your total science and your academic average will appear here on your score report. Okay, so if you are taking the DAT after March 1st, 2025, most of what I just said still applies to you. The main thing that's changing is that right now your scores come on a 2-digit scale from 0 to 30. In the future, it's going to be on a 3-digit scale. So the ADA has released this chart as well, showing an estimate of how scores will be converted or how they will compare from the current 2-digit scores to the future 3-digit scores. So for example, like we were talking about before, if somebody were to get a 24 on the organic chemistry section of the DAT, in the future scale, this could be anywhere between like a 480, 490, somewhere in that range. So I would presume that the ADA is going to continue to use similar metrics when they come up with these scores, but the only difference is it's going to be on a scale from 200 to 600. So if someone were to score a 19 on today's DAT, you use this chart and look and see that in the future, a 19 will be a 400, 410, something like that. I know that this change might be a little bit unsettling, but like I said before, there's nothing to worry about. The content is going to remain consistent, and it's not going to be too much different than it is now. The numbers are just going to look a little bit different. In my opinion, this is actually a pretty good change because these 3-digit numbers are going to have a lot more precision than today's scores do. So how it is today, if 2 people get a 20 on the DAT, they might have actually performed quite differently on their test, but they both get a 20. Whereas in the future, maybe 2 people who get a 21, there'll be a little bit more distinction between somebody who got a 430 and somebody who got a 440 on the DAT. That's just my take on it. Don't worry about it too much. Okay, so now that we've talked about how the DAT is scored, let's talk about what kind of scores you need to get into dental school. In this video, I'm going to continue referring to the 2-digit scores from 0 to 30, but if you're taking the DAT after March 1st, 2025, go ahead and look at that chart that I showed you from the ADA. Convert this information from the 2-digit scores to 3-digit scores, but for the most part, the information is going to be pretty consistent. So here on the screen, I've put some of the most commonly scored scores on the DAT, and here we're talking about academic average, so that main summary score. And some common scores you'll see are somewhere in this range from 17 to 24. Now, right now, the national average that students are scoring on the DAT is somewhere between an 18 and a 19. And once again, if you're taking the DAT in the future, plug these numbers 18, 19 into that chart to get a better idea of what that would look like on the 3-digit scale. The scores that are getting students into dental school on average is between a 20 and a 21 is the average score for acceptance. The lowest score you can get on the DAT while still realistically having a shot of getting into dental school is usually around the 17 to 18 range. range, but you're going to need to make up for it in other areas of your application if your score is somewhere around here. A stronger score, competitive score, is going to be around 22, 23, and anything at a 24 or above is going to be very competitive. So I went through and I looked at some of the most commonly applied to dental schools, and I lined up the schools with their average DAT scores for their recent classes. This information still stays pretty consistent, but you might want to check if you're watching this in the future what the more updated scores are. But take a school like, for example, USC, they have around an average academic average DAT score of 20 for the students they admit. Other schools like Howard and Midwestern, they're going to have lower average DAT scores in this range, and schools like Columbia, Harvard are going to have very high average academic average scores. There might be some universities here on the screen that you're interested in. There might be others that aren't. I would recommend that you start thinking about what schools you're interested in, and then as you're preparing for the DAT, do some research. You can look on the school website, you can look at the ADEA official guide to dental schools to find some statistics about what scores schools are usually looking for. I'd recommend that if there's a school you're really interested in, like for example, University of the Pacific, which has an average DAT score of around 22, try to shoot 4 or above that score that the school usually admits. However, these are just averages. So for example, at a school like University of Florida that has an average somewhere around a 22 or maybe 23, there's going to be lots of students that have DAT scores much higher than that. There's also going to be plenty of students with DAT scores much lower than that. So keep in mind that your DAT is an important part of your application, but it is just one part of it. So schools are going to look very closely at your DAT score, but also GPA, letters of recommendation, your service, leadership, volunteer experience. You're going to look at your extracurriculars, any dental experience you have, your shadowing, etc., etc. All those things and more are very important in the decision process. So just because you get a DAT score that is at or above the average for a school, it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed admission to that school. However, the inverse is also true. If you have a DAT score that is lower than the average for a school that you're interested in applying in, you can still apply and you still definitely have a chance of getting in depending on other factors, because the DAT is not the only thing that they're going to look at. Take this information and use it to set a goal for what you want your score on the DAT to be. So as you're looking ahead to the DAT, you may be wondering about when you need to take it and how long you'll need to study. So we'll talk about that here. So here's a timeline of the year, and every year in the beginning of June, the application to dental schools opens. It's usually around the 1st or so. And dental school admissions are on a rolling cycle, meaning that the sooner that you apply to dental schools, the higher your chances are of getting in. Applying early to dental schools is one of the most important and the most simple things you can do to have a better chance of getting accepted into schools. So this range here from right when the cycle opens, beginning of June, to sometime in the early July, mid-July, is the best time to apply, where your odds of getting accepted are the highest. If you wait until like late August and September and beyond that, your chances of getting accepted into dental school go down more and more over time. So what does that mean for the DAT? Usually, if students are looking ahead to the future, I would recommend to them, try to have your DAT done before June, before the application cycle opens. Now, that's not always the case for everybody. You can take the DAT after it opens in June, and you can even submit your application to dental schools before you've taken the DAT. So let's say that your DAT is scheduled for July 1st, and you know that that's a little bit later in this early region. That's the best time to apply. So if your DAT is July 1st, you could submit your application to dental schools on June 1st when the application cycle opens, and dental schools will get your application and it will just have a note on it saying that this person doesn't have their DAT completed yet, and they'll have everything else on your application. Then when you do take your DAT on July 1st, for example, it'll take a little bit of time to process. Then your score will get added to your application. This is something you can do so that you can still get your application in this early window if your DAT is scheduled for a little bit later. However, it is worth noting that some schools won't fully consider your application until they have your DAT score, while other schools might start considering you even without it. Another perk of finishing your DAT before the cycle opens in June is that you'll know your score, and so you'll have a little bit better idea of what schools you should apply to with your stats and which schools you have a better chance of getting into. So regardless of when you take it, we usually recommend that students take somewhere around 3 months roughly, studying around 6 hours a day to prepare for the DAT. However, this is going to look totally different for everybody. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I did. In my case, I started studying for the DAT last year, and I studied from January to the end of April. And this was a full semester for me at school from January to the end of April. During this time, I was able to have gotten all my really tough classes out of the way beforehand. So I was taking only around 8 credits, and my classes really weren't weren't that difficult. I was also working somewhere between 20 and 25 hours a week, and I had a long commute to work. So it was a little bit tricky to balance, but usually I averaged studying around 5 hours a day. Some days when I worked all day, maybe I would only get in 2 hours in the evening of study, and other days maybe I would get in 6 or even 7 hours of study, but I averaged around 5. By the time my DAT came around, I felt very prepared and like I had studied really hard. However, it's different, like I said, depending on who you are and what your schedule's like. So Dr. Ari, the founder of DAT Bootcamp, he studied for around 2.5 months and he finished his DAT after the cycle had already opened sometime around mid-June, studying around 6 hours a day on average. Another person I know, she only had about 8 weeks to get ready for the DAT. So she was really cramming it in, studying 10, 11, 12 hours every single day for those 8 weeks. And then she took it towards the end of June. Depending on what your schedule is like with school, work, or other extracurriculars, this schedule is going to look different for everybody. But I do want to emphasize that no matter what your situation is, usually you're going to have to carve out time very intentionally to prepare for the DAT. Sometimes students think that they can keep doing their full school schedule, and their full work schedule and just add the DAT on top of everything else that they're already doing. And that's usually pretty difficult to pull off. So I would recommend making time where either maybe it's the summer and you don't have to take any classes, that you can dedicate all your time to the DAT, or maybe like me, you can take a lighter semester with less classes so that you can really focus primarily on the DAT. I'll also mention that when you study for and take the DAT can look different. So for example, maybe you start studying very beginning of the year and you take only about 2.5 months to study and you're done around March. Or also another thing you can do is you can study for and take the DAT sometime in the summer or fall in preparation for next year's cycle. So maybe if you're looking at something like this where you study for 2.5 months, around 6 hours a day, something like that, maybe you do it the second half of the summer. So you start in June and finish the end of August, and then you take your DAT, and then you already have your score for next year's cycle when it rolls around in June of the next year. Whatever way you do it is up to you, but once again, take a look at your schedule and what you think is going to look best for you. So let's talk about when you need to sign up for the DAT after you figured out when you want to study for and take it. So let's pretend that your test date was sometime in around late April. If your test date was around there, you would want to sign up for the DAT. The ADA recommends somewhere between 60 and 90 days beforehand. However, I would recommend if you can figure out, like using the timeline we talked about, you can figure out when you want to take the DAT ahead of time. I would sign up to take it even before 90 days ahead, just because the sooner that you sign up to take the DAT, you're going to have more of the first pick of what day you want to take it, what time of day you want to take it, and what testing center you want to go to. If you were to wait until, let's say, beginning of April to sign up to take your test, or maybe let's say March, there might not be any test dates available for you, and maybe there's one, but it's at a really far away testing center, which I've heard happening to students before. So make sure that you sign up long before your test date. After you've signed up, something I would also highly recommend to you is doing the Prometric test drive. Do it sometime while you're studying, getting ready for the test. What this is you pay around $30 or $40, I think, and you go to a Prometric testing center where you're going to take your actual DAT. And it's nice because it gives you a run through of what everything's going to look like and feel like on actual test day. So you show up to the testing center, you bring all your documentation, and you go through the whole check-in process. They scan you in, they check your ID, they give you scratch paper, and they take you to a computer just as if it were actually your test day. At the computer, you don't get to do any practice DAT questions. It'll just ask you some questions like, what's your favorite color and what's 2 + 2, just to give you a chance to familiarize yourself with the computer. I really enjoyed the Prometric test drive just because after I took it, I knew exactly what to expect on test day. I knew how to get there, I knew what floor to go to. Every time I would take a full-length practice test after having done this, I could picture in my mind exactly what my environment was going to look like and what the computers were going to be like. I even found out what the scratch paper was going to be like, and I went out and got some that was very similar, and I started practicing with that. Which, by the way, most Prometric testing centers will give you for the DAT a piece of yellow laminated paper. Usually on the front half, it has graph paper, like graph lines, and on the back half, it's blank, and they'll give you a dry erase marker. Usually how it works for the DAT is that they give you 2 sheets of that, and you don't have an eraser and you're not allowed to erase anything. So once you fill up your whole sheet, you raise your hand and they bring you another replacement piece of laminated paper. So if you go do the Prometric test drive, you'll see what kind of scratch paper I'm talking about, and you could even maybe get something similar to start practicing with that as you're studying for the DAT. So once you figured out when you're going to take the DAT, if you're using DAT Bootcamp, Dr. Ari has created something very helpful, the study schedule, to help you plan out your study. So staying with the same example of if your test date was in late April, and let's say that you start studying in the beginning of February, this study schedule will show you, for example, in week 1, what you should do every single day of the week to work towards being fully prepared for the DAT. And it does a good job of mixing it up. So you take a look at, for example, on week 1, day 1, it'll have you read the first chapter of biology, then it'll have you watch some general chemistry notes, it'll have you watch a video about how to do some perceptual ability, and then it'll have you read the DAT study guide, and so on and so forth. Every day it tells you what to do. Then as you get closer to your test date, so let's say now you're in late March and you're on week 8 of the study schedule, keeping up with it, it will start to still include the learning tasks like read this section of a chapter or watch these videos on DAT Bootcamp, but it will also start to integrate slowly the practice tests. And then once you get really close to your test date, there are full-length practice tests that will have you start doing. And when you get really close to your test date, you'll just be doing those and reviewing those pretty much exclusively. So it's a great way to walk you through how to use all the resources on DAT Bootcamp and help you get really prepared. I will say that the study schedule is pretty rigorous and it can be pretty tough to keep up with these daily schedules. So if you're using the study schedule and you're having a hard time keeping up, don't get discouraged. Keep working hard, do your best. And if you don't end up completing every single thing that's on the study schedule, it's okay. However, if you can manage to do that and complete every day of the study schedule, you will be very prepared for the DAT. So there are 2 study schedules that Dr. Ari has made. One of them is for a 2.5 month study period, like we've shown here. And the other one is, I believe, a 5-month study period if you were to be stretching it out over 5 months. So now that we've talked a lot about the DAT, you might be wondering, how do I succeed on the DAT? For this next part, I'm going to give you a walkthrough of DAT Bootcamp's website, and I'll show you some of the features as well as how to succeed on each of the 6 subsections of the DAT. So if you're getting really close to test date, this part will hopefully be helpful for you, giving you some of my personal tips on what helped me on each of those sections. So here's what DAT Bootcamp's homepage and interface looks like. If you don't already have an account, you can go to datbootcamp.com and make a free account where you can access a lot of the features that I'm going to show you now. So all of DAT Bootcamp is designed to help you learn, review, and master the concepts of these 6 subsections in a way that will help you succeed on the DAT. So let's take a look at biology, for example. When you click on one of these subsections, you'll see these tabs here at the top, and there are different resources for all the 6 subsections, but all of them do have videos and question banks and practice tests for you to practice and learn the information. Let's take a look at some of these videos. So they're organized into modules, divided into subtopics, and looking, for example, at cells and organelles, let me show you what some of these videos look like. As I was studying with DAT Bootcamp, I felt like these videos were very well made. They were concise and to the point, and what's nice is that they don't teach you anything more in depth than what you need to know for the DAT. It's very to the point, and they use really good graphics. I think the teachers do a good job of breaking it down in a way that's a lot easier to understand than some of the classes that I took in college that were a little bit confusing at times. As you go through these videos, there are these questions built in along the way. After watching that video, you can see how well you're understanding, how well you're following along, and this also gives you an idea of how might this concept turn up on the DAT. So you can choose an answer, and then there's this explanation here that will help you understand why the right answer is the right one. There's also an AI feature, so I could ask, why is A incorrect? Or any more questions if you feel like you need some more help with this one. If you're still feeling like you need help or a little confused, there's this chat feature, and you can use it to reach out to a live tutor who usually will get back to you within at the most a day or 2. And that's always nice to know that you have somebody there too to answer any more questions you have. Another feature that's built into Bootcamp that I really enjoyed is this learning, reviewing, and mastered feature. So if I got this question wrong and maybe I don't really understand it, I don't still know why this is the right answer, and I don't think I'm going to know it going forward, I'll put it into this learning category. If there's a question like this one where maybe I understand it a little bit better, but I'm still not entirely sure, I'll put it in reviewing. And if I get the right answer, I know why all the other answers are wrong, I'm feeling very confident, I'll put it in the mastered category. This is really helpful because then later on, you can go back through just the learning questions that you have sorted in here, or just the ones you have sorted in reviewing, and that we can focus on those topics that are still a little bit hard for you and not spend as much time on the things that you already have really done. So there are more videos and more questions to help walk you through the rest of this information for cells and organelles, and then all these other subtopics as well. As as you go through these modules and you start getting the content down, some of it will be review. Some of it might be things that you're learning for the first time because you didn't learn it in undergrad. You can use these question banks as well. So these are similar to the questions that I showed you before. There's just a lot more of them, so it gives you more of a chance to practice. And same thing with these, use this learning, reviewing, and mastered function. Learn from your mistakes as you go along. Just a good chance to see more and more, how will this information that I'm learning, or I've learned in my classes in the past, or I'm learning on DAT Bootcamp, how will it translate to a question on the DAT? Then as you're going through those, over time, you'll start taking more and more practice tests. So these practice tests, you'll notice that when I click on one of them, suddenly it changes the screen and it looks a lot less aesthetically pleasing. That's because this interface here is designed to look exactly like the actual DAT. The feel of this, how it works, how it moves, is all going to be identical to test day when you're in the testing center. There's even this feature called Prometric delay. It's something that for some reason when you take your DAT, you will have to deal with it. And it's a second or two delay in between each of the questions. So you'll notice that as I click through these, there's that little bit of a hesitation. Sometimes that can throw students off when they get to the testing center, and it can be frustrating when you're trying to get through these questions as quick as you can, but it's built into these practice tests on DAT Bootcamp so that you can get used to it. All the other features like crossing out answers that you don't think are the right ones, highlighting questions, marking questions, and coming back to review them, this is all exactly what it'll look like on the actual test. And using these practice tests, you can get used to that, and it also gives you a chance to see how well you're understanding the material. Another feature I want to point out to you is the analysis feature. After you take a practice test, it'll give you this analysis and it will show you what are the concepts or topics that you're struggling with the most. So obviously this one, I didn't answer any questions, so I would be struggling with all of them, but it will give you your estimated score of what score you would have gotten on the DAT. And then here you can pinpoint what things you need to study the most. So let's say that I had gotten a good percentage of all these right, but maybe the nervous system was something that I really struggled in. Maybe I didn't get any of the questions right for the nervous system, and I spent a lot of time on them that was kind of wasted. That's a good sign to me that I should go back through and focus on the nervous system and the other subtopics that I didn't do too well on. As you go through all these different modules, I won't spend time on all of them, but I just showed you for biology. There's the same thing for all these other ones, and each of them have their own unique features as well that you can use to help you study. For example, there's an OChem on-key deck that's built in here that's really nice and that I used a lot to study. General chemistry has its own features, and all the videos are made by Dr. Mike, who has a really good personality. So they're all a little different, but they all have those resources that I just showed you. As you go through studying these things, you'll also start taking full-length practice tests, and these are just like the individual subsection practice tests, but it's like the full DAT. Same thing when I click on one of these, you'll see the screen changes. It goes into testing center mode so that you can take a practice DAT exactly like it would feel on the actual test day. There's more features that we don't have time to cover. That's kind of an overview of what you could expect with DAT Bootcamp. Now I'll give you some of my tips for each of these subsections and things that I did to succeed in them. Also things that I've talked to lots of students who have succeeded on the DAT, the tips that they've shared as well that help them succeed. As you start studying for biology, you might feel pretty stressed out, and that's totally normal. One of the biggest questions that students ask about biology is how could I possibly succeed, because it's such a broad section. And it is. If you look at just some of these videos here, you'll notice that there are so many different subtopics that you're expected to know, everything from physiological concepts to evolution to animal behavior. You even have to know photosynthesis. Don't get overwhelmed. There is a way that you can successfully study for and prepare for this section. I use these videos a lot, and I use them to review and learn concepts. I also use the notes according to what is said in Dr. Ari's study schedule. My biggest tip that I would give you for biology are these practice tests. I always tell students that these bio videos, these bio notes, like I've said before, they teach you everything that could show up on the bio section of the DAT. And like we said, it's really broad, right? It encompasses all these different things. These practice tests, the questions on them focus on the things that most commonly show up on the DAT. So they kind of zoom in from all the broad concepts that are taught that you need to know to the things that are more commonly show up on the DAT. Because of that, taking these practice tests and then reviewing these practice tests is a really, really good way to prepare for the bio section of the DAT. For myself and most of the students I've talked to, on their actual DAT, they had questions that were word for word exactly the same as they were on DAT Bootcamp. So when I was taking my bio section of the test, I got to question 6, and it was exactly the same as a question that I had studied for and practiced here. Obviously, most of the questions on your DAT are going to be new questions you haven't seen before, but I did feel like the concepts and the topics that were tested here in these tests were, for the most part, what I saw on the actual DAT. And it was a big part of what helped me get a 27 on the biology section. When you're taking these practice tests, take them seriously. And then afterwards, like I mentioned before, go through and use this performance feature to see the concepts that you're missing the most. Then go through each of these questions and sort each and every one of them into learning, reviewing, or mastered. Let's say that you got a question wrong. For example, here's this question asking about monocots and dicots. If you get this question wrong, you could think to yourself, I don't know plants, I need to go back through and study everything from the plant section. And yeah, that would probably be helpful, but a much more efficient use of your time would be to ask yourself, what is this question trying to test me on? Well, it's trying to test me on monocots and dicots. So it wants to know what are the features of each of them. You know, do they reproduce through flowers? Do they have a taproot? Do they have vascular tissue, etc., etc.? Then I would use this explanation here to really hone in on what are the things that I don't understand about monocots and dicots and review those very heavily, using especially this section right here will usually have all the information that you need. Then after you've reviewed it, you feel like you have a good grasp of the information, put it into either the learning or reviewing category, and then move on, do the same thing for the next question. Then over time, you'll have taken several of these practice tests. Then I would go back through the tagged questions and take a look at all the ones that you have marked as red or learning. Go in here and then go through these and try to review them and see if you remember the concepts that you studied before. If you do this multiple times and you keep going through these old questions, then once in a while, I would say go through one of these tests again. So maybe you took biology test number 6 a couple weeks ago, hit review and go through those questions again, especially the ones that you got wrong the first time, and keep doing that. And if you can take all of these practice tests and review them before your DAT, you'll be very well prepared for the biology section of the DAT. Once again, I know I'm reemphasizing this, but long story short, use these practice tests as a way to focus in on what you need to know the most and still know the other stuff that's in the videos and notes, but really make sure that you know these concepts here, and it's a little less overwhelming when you just focus on what's being tested here. Let's talk about general chemistry. General chemistry, like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, was something that was always really hard for me. And when I started studying for general chemistry for the DAT, most of the information I was learning from scratch. I really wasn't reviewing, I was learning for the first time. I felt like Dr. Mike's videos were very helpful to teach the concepts and break them down into a really understandable way. Another tip I'd give you for general chemistry is that it's very, very focused on the equations. Unfortunately, there's not an equation sheet on the DAT. You will need to have them memorized, and more than just have them memorized, you need to know how to use them really well. What I did as I was watching all these videos is over time, I had this designated piece of paper, or it could be a file on your laptop or something, where I added all of the different equations. And then as I went through, I kept filling it up more and more and more, and it became sort of like my master sheet to all the equations for general chemistry. Then every time that I would take a practice test, or as I went through these question banks, especially on these question banks, I would refer back to that equation sheet afterwards so that I could remember, oh yeah, which equation was this? What is it used for? How do I use it? And just having it always on that piece of paper helped me remember better how to use it and what it did. Getting those down is really important. I'd recommend practicing with those. The other thing that I would say is as you take these practice tests, really focus on time. General chemistry is a section where time is so important. One of the reasons why is because this section is the first one you'll have on the DAT that has a lot of calculations in it. And remember earlier we talked about how biology, general chemistry, organic chemistry, they're all lumped into one section, the survey of the natural sciences, and you have one set of time for those 3 sections. General chemistry can easily mess up your organic chemistry score if you spend too much time on it, especially because it's easy to get caught up in all the numbers and waste a ton of time trying to do all these calculations. The way to beat that, the way to make sure that you don't use all of your survey of the natural sciences time on just general chemistry is when you take one of these practice tests, make sure that you're very strict with it. So the question banks, the questions in the modules, take your time, try to push your pace a little bit to get faster, but take all the time you need. If you really need to look at your notes to solve it, maybe use them once in a while. But once you get to these practice tests, don't cut yourself any slack. There's this timer up here. You can pause it. Don't pause it ever. Don't let yourself use your equation sheet. If you have an equation sheet, don't let yourself use your notes. And get in the habit of, if you get to a question like this one and you have no idea how to solve it, like you don't even know where to start, just choose a random answer. Don't leave it blank. Choose a random answer, mark it, and then hit next and just keep going. Move on. Then at the end of the test, if you still have time and you're doing well on time, you can use this review function and then go back to the question that you marked. You can click on it and it will just link you right back to it. If you were to spend 5 minutes trying to solve this question, that probably means that you don't know how to do it very well. You're more likely to get it wrong. And then at the end of the test, you'll probably have to choose random answers for questions that you might have been able to get right. It comes down to my biggest tip for general chemistry is get the time management down very, very well. The way you can do that is by taking these practice tests and being very strict with yourself on time when you do take these practice tests. The next section we'll look at is organic chemistry for tips. Now, my biggest tip for organic chemistry is that it's very, very reaction based. So you have to know all the different reagents and what does it look like when you take this one and combine them? How do they work forwards? How do they work backwards? Can you use it in a synthesis, etc., etc. For this, because there's so many of them, it's kind of hard to keep them all straight. I really liked using the Anki decks. I hadn't really used Anki before. I know some people are really big on it, but I used it to study for the OChem section, and it does a really good job of helping you have that spaced review, and it gives you the reactions that you're not as familiar with more until you get them down. Give it a try, see what you think. I thought it was really helpful. And then other than that, just make sure that you're spending time on your weaknesses. So I found when I got to this section that I understood some things really well, like acids and bases I had a good grasp on, but nomenclature was something that I was pretty weak on. So I spent a lot more time on nomenclature than I did on acids and bases, and then I did on some of the other topics that I knew really well. So make sure you're focusing on your weaknesses. Use the Anki decks to review for the reactions and make sure that you have those reactions down really well. Okay, now let's talk about perceptual ability. So the first time that you try perceptual ability, it's going to feel very foreign and it's going to be really hard. I remember the first time I tried a PAT question, I think I spent like 8 minutes on it and then I got it wrong anyways. It was very discouraging. So know that you're going to start really slow. The analogy that I always use for PAT is, I don't know if any of you play an instrument, but I play the guitar, and the very first time that I tried to play a chord on the guitar, it took me forever. Like it took me 15 minutes just to make the shape, and it was really awkward and really slow and it didn't sound very good. But now many years later, I can fly through chords. It's no problem, super easy. And that speed comes with practice, lots and lots and lots of practice. Use these videos here. They do a really good job of teaching you all the tips and tricks. They teach you different strategies that you can use to approach this. They're very helpful, but know that if you're still really slow or still not good at it, it's probably not because you haven't figured out the trick yet. It's just because you have to do it hundreds and hundreds of more times. I always recommend to students that don't procrastinate studying for PAT. Start very early on in your DAT study and make sure that you do just a little bit every day. It can kind of be nice because it's different from the other topics that you'll need to know on the DAT. So you can kind of look at it as like a game or a way to break up your study time, and just make sure you do it a little bit every single day. If you're still slow, then just tell yourself, I'm slow, I just need to do it a bunch more times. And with DAT Bootcamp, you could quite literally never run out of resources to practice. These question banks have lots of different questions you can practice. And then if you were to somehow finish all the questions in here, you have no excuse to not keep practicing if you're still slow or not good at it, because there are these generators and they will create a literal unlimited amount of questions for you to practice on. Just keep clicking through this and it's never going to stop. It's just going to keep giving me more and more questions. So practice is key for this one. The other tip I would give you for PAT is that on the DAT, the questions will come in this order. So start with keyholes, then go to top, front end, etc., and end with pattern folding. I would figure out which one of these sections is your weakest one. So after practicing a lot and trying to get good at all of them, when you get closer to your test date, see which one is your weakest one. Something that I did and several other students I've talked to did as well is that they figured out what their weakest one, maybe it is cube counting, and then they left that one for last. So they started with the ones they were good at. When they finished, maybe if this was your weakest one, you finish hole punching and you skip past cube counting, do pattern folding, and then do this one last. And that's just a good way to make sure that you spend your time on the sections that you're more likely to get right, and then you don't end up in a situation where you're wasting all your time on a section that you're not as good at anyways. Before you try that strategy, try it out in these practice tests and also try it out in the full length tests just to see if that's helping you get a good score or not, but it's something you might want to try out. So reading comprehension is another one that can be tough for students, and this is something that I promise you can get better at. Similar to what I said about the PAT section, this one just requires a lot of practice. So if you're slow in reading or you're having a hard time with the questions, spend lots and lots of time practicing, do some reading every single day, and you will get faster at it over time. The other tip I would recommend is using these RC Academy videos. They do a really good job, these strategy ones, of teaching you different ways that you can approach the passages. Something that I did is I watched all these videos and then I did this experiment where I did 3 practice passages and I answered the questions using the vanilla method. And then then I did 3 passages answering the questions with the Vic Viper method, then BYU for you, etc., with each of these. And I kept track as I went along what scores I was getting using each of the different methods. Then I went back and I looked at which strategy was helping me get the highest scores, and also which one did I just feel the most comfortable with after having tried them all out. And then after doing that, I ended up realizing that there were 2 methods that were helping me perform better and that I liked more. So I ended up combining those 2 into a sort of hybrid and using those. Try out these different methods, take time to get to know them, and you could even try an experiment like the one I just told you about to see what works best for you. Now, last but certainly not least is quantitative reasoning. So for quantitative reasoning, this is the one that I told you in the beginning of the video that when I first started studying for, I did really poorly. And my advice for quantitative reasoning is this is the math section. And when it comes to math, I feel like most people have a label on themselves where they either say, I'm good at math or I'm bad at math. And whatever label you have for yourself, I just want you to take it off and just throw it in the trash before you start studying for the DAT and for the quantitative reasoning section. The reason is because yes, there is some math on this section, but it's not just about math. It's more about testing your logic and your ability to reason your way through questions. However, the quantitative reasoning portion of the DAT is probably the most predictable section of the whole test, meaning that if you take a look here, you'll see some of these subcategories, right? Algebra, word problems, geometry, etc. Well, as you take these practice tests, you'll notice, for example, that one of the topics is data sufficiency and statistics. So the statistics questions, which by the way, I had never taken a statistics class, but I learned everything I needed to know with these videos. As you take these practice tests, you'll notice that there's this question that asks you, if you have 3 red marbles and 4 blue ones and 2 green ones in a bag, what's the probability that you'll draw a red one, then a blue one, then a green one, or something like that? And that type of question with the marbles in the bag and what's the probability of drawing these ones shows up over and over again in these practice tests, mixed in, of course, with lots of different questions from these different topics. But over time, you'll notice that you're starting to see the same types of questions. And so it's just a matter of getting really familiar with those types of questions and making sure that you understand the concepts behind them really well. Not just memorizing, how do I do this question, but understanding that concept that you need for that question. And doing that, you'll be able to narrow down more of the concepts you need to know. And then also you can get really good at doing them. So after you've seen that kind of marble in a bag question 5 different times and you've really studied it and taken the time to understand it, then when you see it the next time, you'll be able to do it way faster than you were the first time that you ever saw it. Once again, I'm going to point you to these practice tests and really highly encourage you to take these practice tests and to spend time reviewing them to get better at the topics. The more time you spend in these, the better prepared you'll be for the QR section. And you'll also notice that your speed will start to increase because you're getting more familiar with the question types that they ask you. In my case, the very first time I took a quantitative reasoning practice test, like I told you guys, I did so bad it told me my score could not be calculated. And it was really easy to get overwhelmed. But if that ever happens to you in quantitative reasoning or any of the other sections where you do really poorly and you're feeling really down, I talked about this earlier, but really use this analysis feature. And what I did is I looked at it and I said, let's say, for example, if this had been my test, I said, okay, geometry is something that I'm really struggling with. And I did really poorly on it. And instead of thinking to myself that I need to learn all these topics really well, I'm just going to go back through. And for the next 2 hours, my goal is to just get better at the geometry section. So I'm going to look back through this practice test and all the questions that I got wrong. I'm going to go back through the videos on the geometry questions. I'm going to use the question banks to practice lots of geometry questions and watch the videos and take notes and do whatever I need to do. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to take another practice test. And hopefully this time I do better on the geometry section. But maybe now instead of geometry, maybe it's the statistics and data analysis, etc., that I need to do better on. So now once again, I'm just going to take the next day, I'm just going to focus on getting better at this section. And if you do that over time, you'll see that slowly you start to get more and more comfortable, and it's a lot better approach than just trying to get better at everything all at the same time all at once. That's what I did for quantitative reasoning, and it really helped me out. Once again, don't be afraid. It's not just all math, and spend time on these practice tests to get better and faster at the question types that you'll see repeat. One other general tip that I'll give you for the DAT beyond any of these individual sections are regarding these full-length tests. So I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but when you take these full-length practice tests, make sure that you take it like it was test day. So when you take these tests, you'll be maybe at home or maybe at the library, wherever you are, and it's really important that you try to pretend like it's test day. So let me get through this tutorial here. But when you actually start the test, you might have water or snacks when you're studying. When you're studying, it's good to get up and take breaks. Sometimes when I study, I'll put some light music on in the background. But when you take a full-length practice test, don't cut yourself any slack. I would recommend, let's say that your test, your actual DAT test is scheduled for 8 a.m. I would recommend making sure that you start your full-length practice test at 8 a.m. Wake up, exercise, eat breakfast. You could even eat the same thing that you're going to on test day. Anything you can do to try to build a routine and make the experience as much like the real thing as possible. Then when you start the test, don't ever hit this pause button. If you get a phone call, which you shouldn't even have your phone in the room when you're taking these full-length practice tests, I would say, but if you get a phone call or you really need to go to the bathroom or you really want a snack, don't cut yourself any slack. Let this timer keep running here. Then when you get to the halfway point, start a timer and keep yourself to that 30-minute break limit. And maybe figure out during that time, what will help me feel most refreshed during this break? Do I need to go outside? Do I need to eat a snack? Figure that out and then make sure you do that on test day as well. And then when you start the second half of the test, same thing. Don't look at your notes. Keep it very strict. I know I'm really emphasizing that, but a lot of students, they get to test day and they do more poorly on test day than they did on their practice test, and they're really disappointed. I think part of the reason why is that sometimes when we're taking our practice tests, we're a little bit easy on ourselves and we let ourselves have some of those breaks or some of those shortcuts, but on test day, you won't have any of those. So make sure that when you take these full-length tests, you're keeping it strict. And it is going to be hard, but taking the DAT is like running a marathon, and you have to build up that mental stamina, that mental endurance. So these tests are a great way to do that. That's just one other tip that I wanted to give you as you're studying and especially as you're taking these full-length practice tests. Some of those tips for the DAT were helpful, and you'll notice that something that I talked about in a lot of those sections was practice tests, whether they be full-length practice tests or practice tests just for biology or gen chem or any of the other individual subsections. One of the reasons why I've talked about those so much is that I felt like in my experience and the experience of many other students that it was very helpful for them, but also we've collected data that supports it. If you look at this graph here, it shows along the x-axis practice tests taken by students who use DAT Bootcamp. This is from a sample of 275 students who use Bootcamp within the last year or so. And this number of practice tests, it's not just full-length tests. So I don't think anybody's out here taking more than 80 full-length practice tests. That would be kind of crazy. But instead, this is full-length practice tests and those individual subsection tests as well. Here along the y-axis is what those students got on the actual DAT. And you'll notice this trend, right? Of course, that the more practice tests that students took, in general, on average, they ended to better on the actual DAT. So we found that students who took at least 45 practice tests or more averaged 22 on the DAT, whereas students who took less than 45 practice tests averaged significantly lower on the actual DAT. I know I talked about it a bunch, but trust the data. Make sure that in addition to using the videos and the bio bites and all those other really helpful resources, that you are for sure taking practice tests because they're very helpful on the DAT. So earlier I shared with you guys my success story of how I improved my score and was able to get a good score on the DAT, but I'm not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of students who have used DAT Bootcamp to really succeed on the DAT. If you're ever feeling discouraged, I would recommend going to DAT Bootcamp's website and clicking on the success stories and just reading about some of these other students. And you'll find that all these students are people like you, and they come from all different backgrounds and they have lots of different situations while they're studying, but so many of them were able to succeed with DAT Bootcamp, and you can too. So I also want to point out to you guys the DAT Bootcamp app. You can download it and use some of the features for free, even without a subscription. And I found this really helpful for studying on the go. Earlier, I was showing you how you can sort those questions into learning, reviewing, or mastered. What I would do is if I was on the bus and maybe I had 8 minutes of spare time, usually I would probably like scroll on social media or something like that. But while I was studying for the DAT, I would pull out my phone, go on the Bootcamp app, and I would say, okay, I have 8 minutes to try to get down this one concept from this question that I marked as learning last week. And then maybe if I got through that one, I would go to the next question and try to come up with some mnemonics or just review and really solidify in my brain the concepts behind that question that I marked as reviewing. I especially did this for the biology questions from the biology practice tests. And over time, it really added up, and those little odds and ends of time that I had that I put towards studying made a really big difference in the end. I would recommend checking it out and downloading the app. Why use DAT Bootcamp? There are just so many different resources to help you learn the material and so many resources for you to practice the material. All of them are very, very focused on what's on the actual DAT. Now that I'm in dental school, talking to students at my school and at other schools, I've talked to a lot of students who have used DAT Bootcamp, and all of them have said that they felt like the DAT was very similar to the resources that they studied and practiced on DAT Bootcamp. Bootcamp. I showed you guys some of the resources that are on the website, but there's really so many more that we didn't have time to get into, like this sheet here that condenses all the OChem reactions in one place. There's also the PAT videos, tons of review videos, and just so many resources for you to use. So I want to leave you with a couple final tips overall as you're getting ready for the DAT. One is that if you don't feel ready, it's okay to postpone your exam. And I do want you to be careful with this because I don't know if anybody gets to their DAT and says, I feel perfectly ready, I could not be more ready, and I'm 100% confident. We all go in with some nerves, and I remember asking myself, am I really ready? Can I do this? But I would use your full-length practice test scores as a metric to whether you're ready or not. And if you are scoring below, let's say a 17 or 18 consistently on your full-length practice test, that might be a sign that you should push back your test date just a couple weeks. And I only mean that if you're right before your test and your last couple practice tests, full-length practice tests, are below that score. In the beginning, you might get a 14 or 15 on your first full-length practice test. Don't sweat it. You can totally go up from there. But if you get really close and you're still having really, really low scores, maybe think about pushing it back. The other tip I would give to you is to make sure to give yourself study breaks. I know we talked about days where you're studying 4, 5, 6 hours in one day, and that can be a lot, but make sure that you figure out a good way for you to hit refresh, whether it's going and talking to a friend or a roommate, or going outside, or taking just a quick break to eat a snack, do something you love, can make a really big difference in how effective your study is. And the very last thing I would say is that there's no substitute for hard work. So I wish there was some shortcut or some magic bullet that could just give you a good score on the DAT. And I've shared a lot of tips today that I think are really helpful for me, and I hope that you can use to get a good score as well. But at the end of the day, anybody you talk to who has succeeded on the DAT has put in a lot of work and given up a lot of their time towards studying for the DAT. The good news in that is that, like I said earlier, I really believe that if you're willing to put in that time, you're willing to put in that work, and you can study effectively, that you absolutely can succeed on the DAT. So those are the last tips I have for you guys. I'm gonna put my email here on the screen, brendan.weaver@bootcamp.com. And as long as I have that email, you are welcome to reach out to me at any time. So if you have questions about something that I talked about in this video, or more questions about the DAT, something I didn't address, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer your questions. You can also throw them in the comments below, any questions you have, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can, give you an answer. Thanks again for watching this video, and good luck on the DAT.